Hope everybody enjoyed the film. Should I read that? Okay. Since we're live streaming, and probably our live stream viewers don't know, we had just finished the film here called Amala. The film, as we mentioned earlier, this film was produced by TCV School for Amala's 80th birthday, and the film was made by a alumni of TCV, Gelek Pasang, and he actually worked all through the most difficult COVID period on this film, and really worked hard to find some of the old footage, rare footage. Also interviewed his mother, interviewed Amla, and then traveled around to locate friends and people who knew her to interview, though she didn't get to everyone. I see Putin over here, would have been great to interview you as well, but so that's, I mean, really the whole credit goes to Gelek Pasang for his efforts in putting it together. I was just thinking, it's actually the first time I'm sitting with my mother on a stage like this and talking to people, so it's kind of nice. So maybe we can, I think, want to open it up for questions for all of you. But I thought I would start because I think one of the things about that's inspiring about my mother is she was never afraid to tackle anything, no matter how big, as you have seen in the film, when there were really challenging situations. She did not hesitate, and she said, this is what His Holiness wishes, and this is what we have to find a way to do, and she usually always found a way. So I want to ask you, Amla, by, you know, how did you do that, and just what kept you going?
I think what kept us going is the sheer need of the hour, you know, because sorry, the need of the hour. You know, His Holiness had just escaped from Tibet, come to Dharamsala, and all those refugees were pouring into India, and we had to do everything that we could to make the lives of the people better, to give the education to the children, and especially the children. His Holiness always felt that the children are the future seeds for Tibet, and he has emphasized that we must nurture these future seeds of Tibet properly. And so one of the top most priority on the list of what he had to do in exile was the education of Tibetan children. And when you think of the situation in Tibet, and when you are, you know, when you see all the refugees pouring in from Tibet into India, and it was really not at all easy. So when in a situation like that, I think, you know, everybody who could do something, we just had to, you know, not look back, just go forward and do the best we could. And of course, it was all because of the thanks to the government of India and to all the different voluntary agencies that came forward to help the Tibetans in exile. And I think that was also very encouraging to see that there were people who are willing to help the children, you know, to settle the Tibetans, and there was medical help and all sorts of help in the early 60s when we became refugees.
Following that, Amla, no, interesting. Okay, questions. We have Brian and Sarah with mics. So if anybody would like to ask a question, please raise your hand so we can see you. If you could just introduce yourself also as you ask the question.
Dalai, my name is Cameron Gellert. I'm a graduate student here in Washington, D.C. Jetsun Pema, thank you very much for being here. We're all very grateful. I was wondering if you could give advice to all of us in here and all of us watching on what you think we all should do to create a better future for Tibet and Tibetans.
Well, you know, the Tibetan issue, in a way, it's an issue. It's an issue which is now many years. We have been in exile for over 60 years. And, you know, people, as time goes, people tend to forget. And I think this is the time when we really most need the help in the sense of being aware of what's going on in Tibet. Tibet has been occupied by the Chinese for over now 70 years or so, and you know the situation is very terrible in Tibet. So because of the situation in Tibet, those of us who are in exile, we should be the voice for the voiceless. And you know, as Tibet, His Holiness always says that, you know, the Tibetan issue just does not lie just with me. It's, as you know, for every Tibetan, you should be aware of the Tibetan situation, and as a Tibetan, you have a responsibility. We have a responsibility because we are so fortunate to be able to enjoy the freedom outside of Tibet. And then I was just talking this afternoon to the, you know, Voice of America. I was being interviewed there, and I was just telling them, as a Tibetan, you know, whether you're young or old, it's, you know, it's up to us to not to forget what is going on in Tibet. We're outside, but those Tibetans who are inside Tibet, they're going through a difficult time. And today, you saw the film about the education of Tibetan children. In the beginning, it was really difficult, but due to the help that we received, things improved, and today, over 53,000 Tibetan children have passed through the Tibetan children's villages, and they're scattered all over the world. You know, even in America, we have a, you know, TCV, Alumni Association here in DC, in New York, in Minnesota, all these places, and they are, what shall I say, I think they feel for the cause of Tibet. But then it's not enough just for the Tibetans to feel for our cause and to do something. We have to let our friends in the world know what the real situation of Tibet is. Because, you know, China, of course now I think with the economy in China going down, and you know the Chinese are not as popular as they were before, things are a little bit changing. But on the whole, you know, China is a very powerful country that we Tibetans are up to, and I think in the, you know, the Tibetan spirit has always been very strong, and now is the time we have to make it even stronger, because, you know, we are educating now almost the 4th generation of Tibetans in exile, and the link with Tibet is getting thinner and thinner. So I think, you know, we have to make extra effort. And then His Holiness says, you know, as long as you talk about Tibet, Tibet is still alive. So, you know, showing these movies and getting people together, and the occasion that we have here today, it's also for Tibet, and I think as long as we can do this kind of things more often, it'll bring the Tibetan issue away to the outside world, and that we have to, and that's our responsibility. And of course, for us who were the first generation coming out of Tibet, now we have the fourth generation in exile, and now the link, we have to make that link stronger, and we all have to really put an extra effort, because things are not easy. I hope I answered your question.
Sarah, I think we have a question here.
To Lama Jetsun Pema, Ruchana, any condition the Inca, Michizoke, Samo, Dunke, Omdu, Sheja, you comfortable, visit. Shukianare. Enjoy now, we thought I had to act as a leg to celebrate. Tabsadian, I cannot think situated what's on the law to you yesterday. As we just say, was a Maji Pebble, Tabi with the Lunare. And tell them, Sajat Yune, Loju yesterday. And then the Inia Tencho Gyatso, the Vietnamese Situtoria, Laling came in a Madu. That was also in the my relative in the Machira and she wanted to do and chin the ray. And in general, which is to choose on the time, the Munich Humor that Tataja, pardon the American or Michigan level, Celia. That is not something you do not appear in this massive sound and maybe Mate. You're not going to yam have a jelly. That is a mulling. You got the Udisune. Give me a charge of the massive sound yo, Mare. In this, I don't use an amia. Thousand number tone. Until you're not thinking good in it, and doing the CG the title that you watch go metro. Young Mrs. Tundish go metro. We must all something get to be among music. In this number, there is something to Shimoshitare. Rangin Shashagina. Loved and shy themselves, Yashil children's son, Nizumamushi, Yavata, Tota, Karine, and Tencho the world lived to me, Sak, Rangulia, the Kokamo to Cartel, Raj, Lundinkan, Lagasin. That I am around a lot to not live, Lagashan, Loni Shadugania, Jacob Ranzim Mina, Lagashadual, so round the Ratus. Today as a 2 year what they did it. So around top and I think Jacob there, Rawan of the men, Jacob Mezava. Then the CG they told young to Mahombalia, Hazon to Jokolia. Canadian consent and good, as you saw it. Fujana.
Can get to it down out the Taya, not Mangche Pugil, their Lojung told Chutuch and Deva. Like Rangi to it down out the Mone, the Mahomba. Sidung tonic and it Jungres, the Maumba Kandit Jungres yet did the couch darba. Taine, Nanzu, Tanda Yuben, Netangang, Chinjan, and Kayun Chores and be. Venechashana, Raba, Nanzu Pervazu, Ani Capju ki Kasureta, Capjuna Lini, Lumba Dam under Nayori, Gigab Dam under Nayori, Yine, Nanzu. Capture Manda Chiris, me Mungu, Munzich Warpa. Munzich at Carresina, Nanzo Tituch Yubiche, Nanzo Utu, Uti, Yarmuchinashi Yubiche, Daganashi, Nanzu, Tatun Tirba, Zon Neva, Jojo, Taria Penachasha Nanzu, Yabo Ruru Church and Nanzu, Gotu Chiati, Nanzu Tatu Tandarba, Jasanga. Jasang Tanji Shubnashi, who's near the tall Katuki Shabini, who Sayon Martas, who that everis, Ranze, Rayata, Ranze, Susulumba, Loyata Tinzu, Netang tall Tati Sukang Shia to Mari, Ba, Yine Karsure, Gigab Kandechini, Gigab the Nedang told your Mungu to us. Just on your till Gujan, Simshu much up for recently, and want to Peva Yins, Peva Chig One, Karichu Butos, Dindu Chiata, and Simshu much up Gende, and Perdun Buton, Lingu, Kendech Guyune, Lingu Ditolia, shoot your Butwa. Just on want to Simshu Chabin and Sabri, Simshu much up Jen, never give up suit one Kundune. That he can't get ready, Nani till Yichi shoot you. Any machine dates the Susu Lerton and Karsa, you may nothing want to share to Marpa. Yine Susu Miziti, Susu de shooting ya, Susu gave up tall, Katse Chetu, the Shuk Yelchen, Chiguri, any Yagachik toll, Tunda Yagachik toll, Shuk Yelchen. Simshu Machap Chen there to win, then there Debumia your listening. One that I can land near Debati Yuna Mena, Maresum to the Deji, Long Chena.
For the benefit of non-Tibetan speaking audience over here, the question, I'll try to put in just the question and the answer. The question was basically that you had devoted your whole life for the cause of the Tibetan cause. The Tibetan leadership in Dharamsala has also been doing whatever it has tried to do, even to the extent of trying to seek accommodation with the Chinese leadership to find a solution to the Tibetan issue. So many years have passed. Now, so many years have passed since there was the last round of dialogue. So, what do you see as the future course of action? Should there be a review of the situation? Secondly, I myself have retired. I've got my personal freedom. So for the nation, I can see that without freedom, what can we do? Without independence, what can we do? I think that, so what do you think about it? That was the question. And if I may paraphrase your response, basically, I'm not a politician. I'm not involved in this field of politics. I'm devoting myself to education. But what I know for sure is that each of us can do whatever we can, given the current reality. The future is something no one can forecast. The destiny is something that no one can say. It can change anytime. But right now, what all of us can do, as His Holiness says, is never give up. We should never lose our courage. We should never be discouraged. And if we all do that thing, then we have done our part for the cause.
Thank you very much. It was beautiful to hear that exchange in the Tibetan language. I'm Damon Wilson from the National Endowment for Democracy. First of all, thank you for sharing your story. This was a beautiful, beautiful film, and I think it's an important contribution to preserving Tibetan culture, legacy, to have this film. I wanted to ask about that. I've had the opportunity to visit the Tibetan Children's Village. It's beautiful. We're so grateful for the International Campaign for Tibet for hosting this. I wanted to ask about the challenge of continuing to maintain Tibetan culture, identity, unity in the community, in part both because of the success of your commitment to education. Young Tibetans have had the opportunity to become educated, to become more successful. The diaspora has grown and expanded around the world. So with that success of education, how do you keep connection to Tibetan community, identity, culture, as many in the diaspora have become educated and moved around the world? The second part of that is it was so striking to see your education. I've read about it, but to see your education visit to Tibet. The pain with which you saw the lack of schooling of Tibetan children at that time. And yet we know, because of the Tibetan Action Institute's work, that today maybe 1 million Tibetan children are in colonial boarding schools, forced away from their families, being separated from their language, their family, their culture, their identity. Again, another challenge to preserving Tibetan culture. So as someone who's made such an important contribution to this historically, how do you see the preservation of Tibetan culture, identity, language, unity in the future going forward?
Well, in the Tibetan diaspora, everybody is trying their best to keep the Tibetan culture alive, Tibetan language alive. You know, the written and the spoken language is the foundation for any culture. And that's something which we have been trying our best to preserve. And His Holiness always emphasizes that, you know, as a Tibetan, it's important to know your language, to know your culture. And then when you think of it, you know, if you have the language, whether you're in Tibet or wherever you might be, if you have the language, you do not lose your identity. You know, like if you're traveling around and at the airport, everybody's more or less dressed, you know, same, you know, blue jeans and what, you know, Western style dressing. At the moment they start talking, then you can identify from, you know, the nationalities of these people or from what country they come from. So His Holiness has been saying that it's so important to keep up your language, your culture, and that he has been saying that, you know, for years now. And I think somehow it has sunk into the minds of the Tibetans. So wherever the Tibetans are, be it in America, be it in Australia or in Europe, anywhere, now they are really making an extra effort to teach their children their language. Once you retain that language, then the culture also is part of that language. It comes, you know. And of course, it's not easy, but then the parents being aware that you have to keep this alive, that it's important, their effort has made a vast difference. There are some parents whom I have met, when the children enter their back home after school, they only speak in Tibetan because they want their children to know Tibetan. So all sorts of efforts are being made, in, you know, for the Tibetans in exile. In India, we have our Tibetan schools, special schools for Tibetan children. But then in the West, or you know, in the West, wherever there's a Tibetan community, there's a Tibetan Sunday school where the children go to the school, they learn the language, and then they learn, you know, from few years, like 5 years till 16, 17 years, they attend the school. And during that time, they learn a lot about their own background, their culture, their language, and that, I think, sort of leaves an imprint in the person that you are a Tibetan, that you know, your culture is Tibetan. That makes an what shall I say, impression on this young person who's learning. But then at the same time, as you have mentioned, in Tibet, now the Chinese, since about 2 years or 3 years now, we've started these boarding schools where children as young as 5 years old are sent to these boarding schools. And the parents have no right to say, we don't want to send the children. They are taken to these schools, and then they're taught Chinese, and Tibetan is taught as a second language. And in many schools, they don't even teach Tibetan. So this is something that we are now making a hue and cry, you know, all over wherever the Tibetans are, that our children are being taken forcefully by the Chinese, so that now the Chinese realize that, you know, if the Tibetan children are brought up as Tibetans, it doesn't fulfill their purpose. So now they say the best is to, you know, to educate the children in their boarding schools and try to make them as Chinese as possible. And that's one of the reasons why in the early 80s, you know, early 80s, we had children coming out of Tibet, as many as in 1 year, in 80s, 86, 87, we were receiving over 1,000 children from Tibet. You know, and the Chinese kept a kind of a blind eye, saying, oh, let these children go into exile, let the Tibetan government, you know, in exile, educate these children, and then they thought it was going to be a big burden for the Tibetans in exile to take care of these children coming from Tibet. And in the TCV alone, we have educated over 12,000 children coming out of Tibet. And out of that 12,000 children, around 4,000 have gone back. And that was in the 90s when they went back, and you know, and in early 90s, beginning late 80s, they went back. And then when there was the problem in Tibet, you know, the uprising against the Chinese in 1987 during the Olympic and all that, it was those, mostly these young people who were educated, who enjoyed freedom in, you know, in exile, and then they went back to Tibet, and they were the ones who sort of, you know, who rose against the Chinese. And that is that. Then the Chinese started to think, you know, now sending these, allowing these children to go to India and to get an education, getting an education there and returning back, it's a bad policy. So they stopped. Now, since 4 years now, we have not received any children coming out of Tibet. And they've started with their policy of sending the children to the boarding schools. So it's they realize that it's through the young people that they can get results in the future, because the elder Tibetans, they are all very, you know, till date, over 159 Tibetans have self-immolated themselves in protest against the Chinese. And why are they protesting against the Chinese? They said, we are not happy with the policy of the Tibetan, of the Chinese government in Tibet. We are not happy, we want more, you know, freedom. So anyway, that's the message of these people. They can't, you know, they have given up their own life to tell the rest of the world, to tell the Tibetans also that what is going on in Tibet is what the Chinese are doing in Tibet. It's not for the benefit of the Tibetans. And the only way they could show is self-immolation. And this is the cry of the Tibetans. And we as Tibetans and our friends who support the Tibetans, they, you know, I wish they would realize how terrible the situation is in Tibet for the Tibetans. So now no refugees are coming out, completely shut off, and also Tibetans who want to, you know, Tibetans who hold, you know, US passports or European passports, Australian passports, they also cannot travel to Tibet. So Tibet is now completely shut off from the outside world. And now there, of course, with the relationship with the outside world and China, it's not so good now. So there are less tourists going into China and also, of course, into Tibet. And so things are really very, the situation is very difficult over there. So because the situation is so bad, I think it's, you know, we should be more eager to speak more about this and to try to let the outside world know how terrible it is for the, you know, for so many, not only the Tibetans, but then you have the Uyghurs and you have so many other minorities in China who are suffering through the same thing what the Chinese government is doing to the Tibetan people.
Hi, my name is Stephen Kent. I'm here on behalf of the Consumer Choice Center. Thank you for being here with us tonight to see this film. It was lovely. My question is about storytelling, film, and the battle against forgetting. I think what you have just sort of laid out is that there's a unique opportunity right now in the world with China's standing falling somewhat, particularly in the eyes of the West, and there might be an opportunity to tell more stories in a way that we have not heard for several decades in the US. I think Americans are just now waking up to just how much China plays a role in suppressing stories about Tibet in our culture, in our film and television. And I guess I was wondering if there are any specific stories about people or events that have happened regarding Tibet that you would love to see told that maybe have not been. I know there's been 7 years in Tibet and Kundun. You mentioned the 1987 uprising, maybe that's one. But I'd love to know if there's anything you would love to see told as a story.
There have been many Tibetans who escaped from Tibet and who have been in exile, and they have been traveling around telling their stories. But then it hasn't been really going to a large public, It's just small audiences. Now today, the media is such an important kind of the media reaches out to a very large number of people. So I think your suggestion, I know a few people whose story could be if it's filmed or if it's told, it would be of great benefit not only to the international community but also for the young Tibetans, because through my film also, going back to the early years when I started to work and all, I think when many of the young children whose photographs were in the film, they're today grown-ups, in their 50s and 60s, and I think sometimes going back in time and telling the story of the past, I think leaves more sort of a message to make your present more purposeful. And that, I think, is so important, because the human mind is, I think, sometimes very forgetful. We always forget the past. And I think remembering the past and seeing through stories, I think that gives a very strong message to stay strong from within. And that is something I think we Tibetans, we should really try to do. And there are many Tibetan young filmmakers who have made films on different issues, and these films are being shown to a very small number of people. But if we could get it more to a larger audience, I think it would be of great benefit. That's what I feel.
Amala, just the naming the tuning yasir. Na pöne pöli di samba lojo somchi nyoma logu indi kebde ni tisi na ya no pedrukim dina deshe pedrukim dina chilo le tande de arena ya pebegan pebe tizona sule chile achidebe tinje chade yo let me speak in English. I'm a little bit emotional and a little bit scared right now, but I think I have to share this, because as being someone escaped from Tibet with my sister, I was 13 and my sister was 9 back then. We were escaped to India, and we had the chance to study in Tibetan Children's Village. And I do see many alumni from TCV here in this room also, and I think what they're doing right now is the same. They were working in our Tibetan society, coming back to our community and working here and vocal about Tibet. Since we have so many individuals, important individuals in this room today, I think I would like to ask this question. Since Amala, you have been the Minister of Education in Central Tibetan Administration, how important do you see the structure of democracy, Democratic Institute of Tibetan Central Tibetan Administration? Dalai.
Democracy, democracy is something which is very precious for any society. And we Tibetans have been very lucky because democracy was given to the Tibetans by His Holiness, And His Holiness always says that one of the important things that he achieved while in exile is to introduce democracy to the Tibetans in exile, and that we even have a democratic system of government in India, in the exile community. So democracy, even I, personally feel that democracy is so important, and democracy is something that you learn right from the school, And today's education, the best education method today, they say, is critical learning. They say that method is most important because it's most suited for democracy to function well. So for the Tibetans, our people are educated, we have a functioning democracy in exile, but then I think that democracy should be something which, even in the institutions like TCV, we always followed a democratic way of selecting our principals, selecting our heads of the schools, and even selecting the president of the Tibetan Children's Village. And because we practice democracy, today in the Tibetan Children's Village, the person who is the president of the Tibetan Children's Village is one of our ex-TCV students. And I knew him, and I was involved with his education since he was 5 years old. And today he is 67 years old, and he is the president of TCV. So, it's a very, very precious thing. But then democracy is also something which I think people have to be really well educated to know what democracy means. Democracy is freedom for everybody, but it must be freedom with responsibility. You can't just take democracy to do as you please. Democracy is something which has to be honored and which has to be really done. And as democracy is for the people, by the people, and with the people. And that's something which the leaders tend to forget, when they get to the top. So I think democracy is very precious, and you're asking me, what do I think of democracy? That's what I think of democracy.
On that note, we're going to wrap up, but we have representative from the Office of Tibet, Amala. Representative Dr. Nam Gyatso is traveling with the Sikyong in Canada, and Amala, and we have our Capital Area Tibetan Association President Amala. I think you wanted to come and greet Amala here. And as they're doing that, I wanted to ask everyone, please be seated for a little bit because we would like to take an ICT group photo with my mother. And then she will be here, so you can all meet with her a little bit more. I was going to whisk her away, but she said, no, I want to stay there. And she said, I have to speak hello to Pujinla, who is here, who is her school friend from Darjeeling back in the days. Amala from the Office of Tibet. Amala, Capital Area Tibetan Association President. And I'm going to ask all our ICT staff to quickly come. I think you're all here. Maybe our ICT board members also can join us. From ICT present.
Everyone, make sure you can see the lens. Make sure you can see the lens. Then the lens can see you. Okay. Last one. Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry.
James, 3, 2, 1.
Oh, can't go there.
Perfect.
Thank you.
I put my finger here all the time.
Thank you, everyone.